You know, when we think of revolutions, we usually picture gunpowder and steel, right? Things born on battlefields or in the halls of power. But what if the biggest revolutions, the ones that truly change everything, actually start somewhere much, much quieter? What if they begin with just the rustle of a turning page?
Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. The name itself is monumental. He was a soldier, a statesman, a man who led a war for independence, dismantled a 600-year-old empire, and built the modern Republic of Turkey right out of the ashes. But here's the thing. The blueprint for that entire nation, it wasn't sketched out in a war room. It was assembled, piece by piece, from the shelves of his own personal library. So, that really brings us to the big question for this explainer. How on earth did a man, staring into the abyss of his world's total collapse, find the ideas, the inspiration, and, this is key, the historical justification to build something entirely new? Well, the answer is hiding in plain sight, in what he chose to read. So, if we really want to understand the mind of this revolutionary, we've got to go right to the source. And that source isn't a battlefield or a palace, it's his library. Let's take a look at the books that built a nation.
First, let's just talk about the sheer scale of it. 4,289. That's how many books we know were in Atatürk's personal collection. I mean, let that sink in for a second. This was not a casual hobby. For him, reading was a critical tool of statecraft. It was a lifelong, relentless mission for knowledge. And this quote? This pretty much sums up his entire philosophy. For Atatürk, history wasn't just a bunch of old stories about what happened in the past. Oh no, it was a laboratory. It was a practical guide just jam-packed with real-world lessons on what works, what fails, and most importantly, why. So the very first problem he took on with his reading was a diagnosis. He needed to understand with clinical precision why the mighty Ottoman Empire, his home, was falling apart. He was basically performing an autopsy on a patient that was still breathing. And this timeline just lays out the escalating crisis. Starting in the mid-19th century, it's just one gut punch after another. You've got the Tanzimat reforms, which were supposed to modernize everything, but they're followed by huge territorial losses, the catastrophic decision to jump into World War I, and then finally, the humiliating armistice that was pretty much the end of the line. And this is where we get to see his mind really working. These are his actual notes on a text about those very reforms. He's not just passively reading here. He is in an active dialogue with the past, picking apart every failure to figure out why these attempts weren't enough. He had to know, so he wouldn't make the same mistakes. So his diagnosis was pretty clear. The old multinational pan-Islamic identity of the Ottoman Empire, it just wasn't working anymore. That story was over, which meant he had to find a new one. And that search sent him on this deep intellectual journey, looking for Turkish roots that went way, way beyond the Ottomans.
This was the fundamental question, right? If this new country wasn't going to be defined by that old imperial identity, then what was going to hold it together? What was the new glue? What was the core of who these people were?
And his search took him back, way back. Here, we're looking at a page from a book he was studying about Attila the Hun. He was digging deeper than the entire Ottoman period, all the way into a pre-Islamic Central Asian Turkic past. He was looking for a new, secular foundation for a national identity. And this just illustrates the point perfectly. Look at how he's heavily marking up these passages about the Orkhan inscriptions, the oldest known writings in a Turkic language. Why? Because a modern nation needs a distinct culture, and crucially, its own purified language. You can draw a straight line from this academic research in his study to his famous massive language reforms years later. It's incredible. But hey, building a nation isn't just about culture, right? It's also about power, strategy, and leadership. And Ataturk, being a soldier himself, naturally turned to the great commanders of history for some practical lessons in statecraft. He turned to the heavy hitters, the great conquerors like Timur. You might know him as Tamerlane, one of history's most powerful empire builders. But Ataturk wasn't just reading to admire his conquests. As we're about to see, he was hunting for the mechanics of power, and he was never, ever a passive student. Okay, look closer. Look at his handwritten notes in the margins. He's actually questioning Timur's decisions. He's analyzing his strategies. He's even praising his successes. This isn't reading. This is a full-on debate with a man who'd been dead for centuries. He's putting himself in his shoes, trying to learn from every victory and every mistake.
So, what were the big takeaways from all this? Well, from guys like Genghis Khan, he saw the unbelievable power of a disciplined, unified nation. From Timur, he learned that real, lasting power isn't just about military might. You have to support science and art, too. And from Alparslan, the Seljuk Sultan, he studied the kind of strategic vision you need to build a whole new state from scratch. All right, so he'd diagnosed the problem, he'd found a new national identity, and he'd studied the playbook of great leaders. All the pieces were on the table. The final step was to put them all together into a practical blueprint for a new republic.
And this slide right here, this shows one of the most direct connections you could ever hope to find. He's highlighted a passage describing something called the ancient Turkic Kurultai. Now, what was that? It was an assembly of chieftains. They'd meet up to make the big decisions, and this is the critical part, to elect their leader, the Khan. You see what he found there? This ancient, pre-Islamic, and very distinctly Turkish tradition of people getting together to govern themselves gave him the historical precedent he needed for the heart and soul of his new state, the Grand National Assembly, an institution founded not on divine right, but on the will of the people.
And let's be absolutely clear, the change he was pushing for was revolutionary. I mean, we're talking about going from a sultanate based on divine right to a republic where the people are sovereign, shifting from religious law to a secular civil code, and changing people from being subjects of a sultan to being citizens of a nation. This was a total rewrite.
And here it is, the culmination of all that work. This is the actual text of the law that officially abolished the Ottoman Sultanate in 1922. And those pen marks? Those are his. This is the exact moment where thousands of hours of reading, studying, and thinking became reality, ending a 600-year-old dynasty with the stroke of a pen. At the end of the day, this is what made Atatürk's relationship with history so powerful. The past wasn't some dusty relic to be put on a shelf and worshipped. It wasn't an identity to be trapped by. For him, it was a toolbox filled with practical lessons, amazing ideas, and serious warnings that you could use to engineer a better future. And that kind of leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? Ataturk's library proves that history isn't some static story about what happened long ago. It's a living, breathing resource for building what comes next. It really is a toolbox. So the question isn't just about what he read, but what are we reading? What tools are we